moving on to chapter 23, the digestive system. So the plan for this series of lectures is we're going to go have basically an overview of the digestive system. We'll talk about digestive processes as a whole. We'll talk about basic functional concepts, digestive system organs and the relationship. And then we'll jump into what we're going to define kind of as the functional anatomy of the digestive system. So we'll kind of focus on each area of the digestive system and talk about the functional anatomy, basically how those structures carry out their function. So we'll talk about the mouth and the associated organs. Then we'll move into the digestive processes of the mouth, basically how we move our food stuff from our mouth through our esophagus and then down into our stomach. We'll talk about the function of the stomach and the parts of the stomach that carry out those various functions. We'll move into the small intestines and we'll talk about their associated structures, and then large intestines. And then we end with talking about the physiology of digestion. And really this notion, when we talk about the physiology of digestion, we're talking about basically digestive breakdown and absorption. So I know you guys cringe when you think of the word or you see the word physiology. This is a very simple physiology and a lot of memory. It's just pure kind of memorization in terms of the enzymes that are required, for example, for breaking down different food stuff. That again, we'll talk about that towards the end of this lecture. So the objectives list is here. Again, as per usual, make sure you guys are looking at that as you work through excuse me, the material for chapter 3. So when we look at the digestive system, it can actually be broken down into two groups of organs: the alimentary canal, which is often referred to as the GI tract or gastrointestinal tract. And what it includes is the tubular structure from mouth to essentially anus. So for example, you have your mouth, you have your pharynx, you have your esophagus. This goes down and connects to the stomach. So we could literally draw, or basically if you swallowed a rope, it would go down the esophagus, okay, and into the stomach, and then from the stomach it would enter into the small intestines, okay. This would then enter into the large intestines. This would come down and go out your anus, okay, or your anal canal. So I always put this awesome visual in my students' heads, which is if you swallowed a long piece of rope, okay, and pooped it, held one end out here and pooped out the other end, you could floss through your alimentary canal, okay, because it is literally a tube open to the external environment on both ends, okay. So if that piece of rope or floss went through the structure, or whatever structure that rope goes through, is part of that alimentary canal, okay? Now, in addition to the alimentary canal, we also have accessory digestive structures or organs. These are includes things such as our teeth, our tongue, our gallbladder, which is located on the inferior aspect of our liver, and then we have a number of digestive glands. So we have salivary glands located up here in the oral cavity. We have our liver, which is this big honking structure right here. It is a fairly large structure, as well as our pancreas. And our pancreas is kind of hidden behind our stomach, but it's kind of this yellow glandular structure we'll talk a lot more about here in a little while. Okay. So moving on to our digestive processes, there's 6 essential activities that the digestive system has to be able to carry out in order to carry out proper kind of homeostatic balances within this organ system. So the first thing that the digestive system has to be able to do in order to carry out its function is it has to be able to ingest, right? That sounds silly, right? But you cannot break down nutrients if you don't ingest those nutrients, okay? So that's the first essential activity that has to be done. The second essential activity is that we have to be able to propel our food stuff through our digestive system. So propulsion occurs via 2 mechanisms, okay? One is through a process known as peristalsis. And I know this is really small here on the screen, but hopefully you guys can see that on the slides that you're working off of. And peristalsis is really a wave-like contraction where it basically is a very rapid movement of a food particle or foodstuff through the digestive or the tubular structure. And so what you get is basically you get a contraction wave that ends up pushing this large bolus down. Again, these are kind of used, this type of contraction or propulsion is used for rapid movement. It occurs in the esophagus, it occurs in the stomach, the large intestines, and the small intestines as well. Another type of propulsion we get is one that is more a mixing propulsion. So this is called segmentation. And essentially what you can see is, and this typically occurs in the small intestines where we need mixing to occur, is it creates these various pockets, okay, that are pinched off by the intestinal smooth muscle. And then what happens is it basically pinches off at other locations. And so you get this mixing of these different compartments, okay? But in that process, it also kind of moves this food stuff along as well. So this is a much slower propulsion than peristalsis, but it's still a propulsion because the food stuff is still going to slowly move down as it gets pinched off from compartment to compartment. Okay. Segmentation is also a type of mechanical breakdown, which is our third essential activity. So when we talk about mechanical breakdown, this is a physical kind of manipulation or breaking down of foodstuff. So, and a perfect example of mechanical breakdown would be the teeth, right? You bite into a sandwich, right? And the teeth will grind that foodstuff down into a much more simplified version of what you consumed, right? So various areas in our digestive system will carry out mechanical breakdown. So for example, the mouth, which is chewing, the stomach will actually do some mechanical breakdown while it's churning, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the stomach. And then this process of segmentation that we just talked about will also be a type of mechanical breakdown that we see carried out by the digestive system. The fourth essential activity is digestion itself. Digestion itself typically involves a chemical breakdown where we utilize typically chemicals or enzymes to take our large macromolecules, such as, for example, our starches and our carbohydrates and our proteins, and we're going to break them down into their building blocks, such as glucose, fructose, galactose, amino acids, so on and so forth, okay? That is the process of digestion. Now, we can digest all the stuff that we want in the digestive system, but if we don't have a way of getting that into our bloodstream so we can transport it to the rest of the body and the cells, so our fifth essential activity is absorption, okay? We have to have a way of getting these nutrients out of our bloodstream, okay? And what we'll learn is that some of those nutrients actually enter the lymphatic system. I will learn that towards the end of this lecture. And we do this via the absorption process, okay? And the last thing is we need a way of getting rid of the byproducts of this digestion. Now, I don't necessarily mean byproducts. There are certain things that we are unable to digest. So essentially, we have to have a way of getting rid of the undigestible stuff, okay, and we basically do this through the process of defecation. Now, defecation is just a fancy word for pooping, okay? So when we look at the overall gastrointestinal tract and its a regulation or regulatory mechanism, okay, it does it via two major mechanisms. One are via mechano and chemoreceptors, okay? So for example, you are chewing a burger, okay, a veggie burger or a cheeseburger, Okay. And when you swallow that bite, that what's called a bolus, it enters your stomach. Okay. Now your stomach, as you put more food in it, will start to stretch. Okay. That process of stretching, right, are going to trigger mechanoreceptors. Okay. But now you've also changed the chemical environment of the stomach, which will also trigger our chemoreceptors. Okay. So the process of the digestive system, or the gastrointestinal tract, will be triggered. The secretion of these enzymes, the digestive mechanisms, will be triggered by stretch within the organs, changes in osmolarity, changes in pH, presence of substrates and end products of digestion. Okay, and as a result of this, will initiate a reflex. Okay, that will either activate or inhibit our digestive glands, or stimulate smooth muscle to mix and move the lumen's content. So we just talked about that notion of propulsion, right? It's not that propulsion just happens spontaneously, even if there's nothing there, right? This is all being created by these mechano and chemical receptors. In addition to that, we also have intrinsic and extrinsic controls. Remember, whenever we talk about intrinsic and extrinsic, intrinsic is within or inside. You can think about this as inside. Extrinsic is external. Okay, so some type of control within the digestive system, some type of control outside of the digestive system is how you can think of as intrinsic and extrinsic controls. So these two control systems occur via what we call short reflexes and long reflexes. So we have short reflexes, which is called the enteric nervous plexus, or the gut brain, that are going to respond to stimuli within the gastrointestinal tract. Now, the gut brain axis, it's interesting in that in every other organ system in the body, the nervous system sends a one-way signal to every other organ system. The digestive system is one organ system that actually sends a signal back to the brain. So, for example, we'll talk about this later. 80% of dopamine, okay, which is a neurotransmitter, is actually made in the stomach and transported up to the brain, where it acts as a neurotransmitter. So there's this very interesting two-way highway between the digestive system and the brain, okay, that we don't see in any other organ system. Okay. So typically this short reflexes is considered an internal reflex or intrinsic control, because it's basically responding to things within the digestive system. So chemicals being sensed within the tubular structure or stretch, these cause a localized reflex, okay, that can also be sent to the brain, okay, and signal things to the brain, okay. However, this short reflex, again, is within the digestive system. There are long reflexes, which are more of our extrinsic controls, okay, and these are going to respond to stimuli inside or outside of the gastrointestinal tract. So, for example, you see the cheeseburger sitting on, I always use cheeseburgers. You'll find that I love cheeseburgers and liquid cheese and French fries, okay? You'll see the whatever meal of choice you have sitting there right in your mouth starts to water. That is actually a reflexive reaction for the initiation of digestion. So your body is preparing for the consumption of a food product. Okay, that is what we refer to kind of as an external stimuli. Even though you have not consumed anything, okay, that's going to activate or trigger, okay, the central nervous system to communicate to the digestive system to initiate this process of digestion and preparation for this stuff coming in. So before we jump into kind of the functional anatomy of the different organs within the system, I first want to talk about some of just the basic anatomy, our serosa that exists within our abdominal cavity. So we know when we've talked about the heart, we have the pericardium, we have the visceral and the parietal pericardium. We talked about the lungs, we had the pleura, we had the visceral and the parietal pleura, okay? In the peritoneum, we are in the abdominal cavity, we have the same thing. We have, however, in the abdominal cavity, it's referred to as the peritoneum. So the serosa associated with the peritoneal, or with the abdominal cavity, is the peritoneum. So we have our visceral peritoneum, and this is the membrane that will cover the digestive organs. And then we have our parietal peritoneum, and this is the serosa membrane that covers the wall of the digestive, or of the abdominal cavity. Okay. So in addition to that, we have our peritoneal cavity, which is the space that exists between these two membranes of the peritoneum. And there's a fluid in there. And this fluid will typically lubricate our organs. Now, there's some homeostatic imbalances, especially in fetuses or in infants, where this fluid isn't sufficient, and you actually get fusion of the organs to the abdominal wall, okay, which can actually be fairly dangerous. In addition to this, we have a structure known as a mesentery, and the mesentery is this absolutely beautiful membrane structure. And I wish if we were face to face, you guys would get the joy of being able to see this. But essentially, it's a fan-like structure, and it's a membrane that contains our blood vessels and our lymphatics and our nerves. And it serves all of the organs, but it can be really well visualized within the small intestines and the large intestines. Mainly the small intestines, because this is where we need a massive blood supply. We're going to learn this is where the majority of our absorption occurs. But it's also there to hold our organs in place. It does store some fat that helps kind of serve as a storage site. So when we look at the histology of the alimentary canal, we have 4 basic layers or tunics. We have our mucosa layer, our submucosa, our muscularis externa, and our serosa, or our visceral peritoneum. When we look at the breakdown of kind of these different layers, our mucosa layer is the most inner layer. It's going to basically be exposed to the lumen of the alimentary canal. And it functions differently based on where we are within the digestive system, okay? So the mucosa has kind of 3 major functions, and depending on where we are, it will do one of them or it'll do all 3 of them. So for example, the mucosa in certain parts of the body will secrete mucus, digestive enzymes, and hormones, okay? And so for example, it does this in the stomach, the mucosa, okay? But it doesn't, the stomach mucosa doesn't absorb end products of digestion, nor does it protect against infectious disease. But for example, the small intestines does all 3 of these, okay? So this is what I mean, based on where we are in the digestive system is going to determine what the function of that mucosa is. And when we get ready to talk about the functional anatomy, you'll be able to come back and say, oh yeah, now I see where these functional differences occur. Now, the mucosa is actually made up of 3 sublayers. It has our epithelium, and this will be anything from, this will basically essentially, in majority of the digestive system, be simple columnar epithelium, okay? And it'll contain mucus secreting cells. One exception to this is the esophagus and the oral cavity, or the mouth, which is a stratified squamous epithelium. It is not a simple columnar. Everywhere else in the digestive system is a simple columnar epithelium. More superficial to that, so here, if this right here is our epithelium, okay? Then next to that, which is our next one here in this region here, we have what's known as the lamina propria. Anytime you think of lamina propria, this is our glue that's going to hold the epithelium down. So it's comprised of a loose areolar connective tissue. However, it does contain capillaries for nourishment and absorption. In addition to that, we have a muscularis mucosa layer. Now, this is different than our muscularis externa layer, Okay, this mucosa layer is a very thin layer of smooth muscle associated with the mucosa, and it's only for localized movements of that mucosa. It does not do peristalsis or segmentation. This is a very localized movement. Okay. Our next two nicks are our submucosa and our muscularis externa layers. So our submucosa, again, is going to basically be a little bit farther out. It also is going to contain areolar or connective tissue. We have a much larger blood supply and lymphatic vessels. We have actually lymphoid follicles here. This is basically where we'll find those Peyer's patches is within this submucosal region, as well as a submucosal nerve plexus where we find those nerve fibers. More superficial to that, we then have our muscularia externa layer. And this is the layer that's responsible for those big movements, right? So those movements of peristalsis and segmentation that I alluded to a few slides ago. And how it does this is actually contains, the muscularia externa layer contains two different layers of smooth muscle. One layer that is a circular layer and one layer that is a longitudinal layer. Okay, and we'll talk about those a little bit more later on. So moving into kind of our first kind of area of functional anatomy, which is the oral cavity. So the oral cavity is actually comprised of the mouth, the lips, the cheek, the palate, the tongue, the salivary gland, and the teeth. However, I am just going to talk about these most likely because you guys know what lips are and you know what cheeks are. And the palates are hard and our soft palate, okay? And these don't really have much functional and function to them. So I kind of skip over them, even though, not that they're not important, and talk about the three structures that actually have a little bit more functional significance to them. So the first one is our tongue. Obviously our tongue is a skeletal muscle. It has intrinsic muscles that change the shape of our tongue and extrinsic muscles that alter the tongue's position. So if you take your tongue and put it kind of towards the front of the back of your teeth and then towards the back of your tongue, right? Positioning, those would be your extrinsic muscles. If you're someone that can curl your tongue or make your tongue into a little star, those would be intrinsic muscles. Okay, so when we talk, right, we use a combination of our intrinsic and extrinsic because our tongue is fluctuating in its shape, but also in its position to pronunciate our words. Its functions include, obviously, speech, okay, is a big one of the tongue. It's also involved in the initiation of swallowing and taste. So when you think about swallowing, right, the tongue pushes the bolus up against the roof of the mouth and that initiates a process. So we'll talk about swallowing here in a minute, how swallowing is actually both a voluntary and involuntary process. But the tongue is also responsible for repositioning and mixing our food, doing chewing, and creating something called a bolus. So when we put food substance into our mouth, okay, we chew, we move that around, and eventually we create a kind of a ball of food, and that's what is called a bolus. Okay. Now, the tongue is also responsible for secreting an enzyme known as lingual lipase. Anytime you see the suffix ase, think of an enzyme. Okay. So lingual is tongue. Lipase, lip is lipid. Okay. So this is a lipid or a fat digesting enzyme that gets secreted by the mouth. However, it doesn't function until it reaches the stomach. Our next structure within the oral cavity is our salivary glands, and the whole function of the salivary glands is to produce saliva. And even though the salivary glands are associated with the oral cavity, they actually lie outside of the oral cavity. And we have three salivary glands that salivary glands that exist. Our first one is our parotid, which is this structure right here. The parotid gland, I always think of the parotid gland, or I always can feel the parotid gland secrete a massive amount of saliva. When you eat something really sour, you can actually feel it clenching down, like contracting and releasing that saliva. And that duct comes in and secretes in the superior aspect of the oral cavity. We have our submandibular gland, which is this one here. Sub means below, and obviously it's below our mandible. It comes up and secretes through a number of ducts, just kidding, a number of ducts towards the front. And then we have our sublingual gland, which is here. That's the one that has a number of ducts that come up and basically secrete underneath the tongue. So we have these three major glands, or these three glands, that are all going to secrete saliva. The function of the saliva is actually kind of multifold, or multifunctional. It's going to clean our mouth. It's going to dissolve our food chemicals for taste. So some of you may have experienced or done last semester where you took sugar, you wipe your tongue off and you dry it off, and then you put sugar on it and you notice that you can't taste anything. We did that in special senses. We usually do it in a face-to-face. I think I had you guys do it when we moved online last semester. But this basically, in order for us to taste our food products, we have to have our food chemicals in an aqueous environment, okay? It's also going to moisten our food and compact our bolus, right? Some of you may have tried the saltine challenge, where you try to put as many saltines in your mouth as you can and try to chew it, and you can't because the saltines are so dry, it dries up your saliva, and then you basically cough out all of these saltine particles. Saliva also initiates the breakdown of starches, and that is because saliva contains an enzyme called salivary amylase. And amylases, these here, are responsible for the breakdown of starches. Okay? So if you were to take a saltine cracker, right, you take that in your mouth, it's salty, right, you start chewing it. If you chewed it long enough, that saltine would actually turn slightly sweet. And that is because this salivary amylase, which is found in our saliva, takes those starch molecules and starts breaking them down, right, into glucose. So you can actually get a slight sweet taste if you chew it long enough. So when we look at the composition of saliva, the majority of it is water. It has a slightly acidic pH to it. It contains electrolytes, so our sodium and our potassium and chloride and phosphate. Oh, here is our infamous bicarbonate ion, the one that you guys love so much from the respiratory system that I told you is going to come back and keep haunting you if you don't learn to love it, the bicarbonate ion. It has our salivary amylase, and of course it's going to contain our lingual lipase that's being secreted from the tongue, because the tongue is going to secrete it into the oral cavity, which is going to combine with our saliva. It contains mucin, which when combined with water becomes our mucus, why saliva has a slight, not density to it, a slight viscosity to it. It does contain some metabolic waste, such as urea and uric acid. And then it also has other things like some lysozymes, our IgAs, right? IgAs help protect us from microorganisms entering our body. Defensins, and a cyanide compound that protects us against microorganisms. The last structure in the oral cavity that we're going to talk about are our teeth. Obviously, our teeth are there to tear and grind food for digestion. We have two different sets of teeth. We have our primary teeth. These are also known as our deciduous. Yeah, our deciduous teeth that we get when we're born. And then we get our permanent dentitions, which are just teeth, are formed typically by the age of 21. So when we look at our deciduous or our milk teeth, we have about 20 of them. And these will typically erupt anywhere from 6 months to 24 months of age, and they'll erupt in a very stepwise fashion. So typically your incisors, which are your chisel-shaped teeth, these are ones that are for cutting, will come in first. And then your canines come in next. These are your fang-like teeth that are there to tear and pierce. And then we have our molar, our first molars that come in. And then our second molars. Eventually, over time, these roots get absorbed, and your teeth start to fall out anywhere between the ages of 6 and 12 as your permanent teeth come in. And once your permanent teeth come in, you have about 32 permanent teeth. All but your third molar are in by the end of your teenage years, so your adolescence. Typically, the third molar, if it erupts, it will erupt between the ages of 17 and 25. This third molar is also known as your wisdom tooth. Typically, it's removed because for some reason the mouth is actually, in most people, not large enough to accommodate the third molar. So they'll remove that third molar, the wisdom teeth, so that you don't get overcrowding of your teeth. So again, we have the incisors, which are there for cutting. We have our our canines, which are there for piercing. We have our premolars, which are good grinders and crushers. And then we have our first molar and our second molar, and then again our third molars, which look similar to our premolars. But these are the best grinders. This is why when you chew food, you don't usually chew food in the front of your mouth. Okay? Because our teeth towards the back are designed to grind the crap out of our food products.